Yes, so this is the last talk of the day, I think. So the headliner. I really like the UK expression, which is the graveyard shift. So well done for making it this far. Because we're starting a little bit late, I will try to be speedy and certainly won't run the entire planned hour. So my name is Stanovic. I'm the head of department for sound and music at University of the Arts in London. I also run an organisation called British Electroacoustic Network, which is a member of the International Confederation of Electroacoustic Music. And I'm going to talk to you about something which, well, I'm going to try and do two things. I'm going to very quickly try and persuade you that electroacoustic music is the best music on the planet. And I'm secondly going to try and convince you that this kind of forum is really essential. And I'm going to try and explain why I value this sort of activity so much. Now, a very, very brief slide, because you've already kind of heard what electroacoustic music is to an extent. So electroacoustic music is, as the word suggests, electroacoustic. Its history is taking sound from the world around us and using that sound to make music. So for a large part of the history of electroacoustic music, it's people making recordings, typically outside of a recording studio, and then using those recordings to compose. Nowadays, the term encompasses slightly more, so it can also be for purely electronic signals, purely electronic sounds, and so on. But at least originally, the idea was to make this connection between sounds in the world around us, acoustic sounds, and the digital now mediation. So a couple of examples. So I'm signed to a record label called Emprunt Digital, which is based in Canada. So there are three solo albums that I've done. The middle one is not actually out yet. It's going to be out next week, I think. And these are all examples of what's called acousmatic music, which is music specifically taking recorded sound and using that to make fixed media. So it's in a sense not live, although we'll come to that in a moment. So a couple of examples of pieces. If these play. So this is a piece based on, let me just turn it. Little light. It should be playing, there we go. There's no sound at the moment. This is a piece which I composed a few years ago based on an industrial heritage site in the town where I live called Sheffield. So I'll play you a little example.
Better from the computer.
We'll live with the buzz.
Better from the laptop.
It is.
And is it on Macs or the laptop?
It's on my laptop. the start of a piece which was recorded, everything recorded on location in this industrial heritage museum. And this was a collaborative project with about 10 composers. We all went on site, made recordings. And my piece is using the natural rhythms of these huge industrial machines and gradually trying to form metric rhythms out of them. So by the end of the piece, you end up with something which is almost like a dance piece. Another example, this is a piece, I had the great fortune to have a job in Hong Kong for a period of 4 years. And I was traveling there for short periods of time to examine a university. And while I was in Hong Kong, I was making recordings of the city. And this piece kind of explores those recordings, and it tries to capture this wonderful moment that I experienced every time I went, where I fly, middle of the night, land in Hong Kong, be jet-lagged, slightly hungover, and staggering around the city at 2 in the morning when I couldn't sleep. And there's this moment in Hong Kong where everything sort of goes silent in this massive metropolis with these skyscrapers. But there's this sort of electrical charge running through the air. And I wanted to capture that moment in sound of this kind of energy of silence. While I was there during that period, there were huge political changes in Hong Kong, with the autonomy of Hong Kong suddenly dissolving and it becoming more affiliated with mainland China. And the atmosphere on the streets as a consequence of that was very electric. So all these kind of recordings that I made, I felt are really charged with this sense of this electricity. So just a little example. Let's turn it up here. One of the things I've been most interested in, though, in my own composition is how you can create enormous contrast with electroacoustic music. So this next example is a piece that I wrote in homage to one of my lecturers, one of my first lecturers during my undergraduate degree, a composer called Dale Perkins. He composed a series of pieces called Voice Without Words, which were all compositions using recorded vocal sounds but without anything intelligible coming from them. And his practice was entirely based on the idea of disintegration. So he would take recordings and gradually disintegrate them to make rhythms out of them. He had a heart attack a couple of years ago. He's fine, he survived, but in my horror at the possibility of him having died, I wrote him a piece which was a hymn based on a lot of his ideas, but using the same idea without any words. This kind of music really isn't designed for this context with two loudspeakers. It's designed to be played on huge systems with many, many loudspeakers to make that sound world completely enveloping, so you're surrounded by sound, and without the 50 hertz buzz. So this is an example of the one of the first concert spaces that I played in a town called Bourges in France, and that's just the view of the stage. With a loudspeaker array, but actually the seating is completely surrounded and you had loudspeakers on a level plane, but in a huge circle around you. A couple of other places that I played fairly recently where you can kind of see here all of the black silhouettes are loudspeakers. This one in particular is great because it's got that rig up at the top, kind of like up here, where you can mount speakers in the ceiling. And this was a concert that I did earlier this year in April, the GRM in Paris, and this is called the Acousmonium. It's a system specifically designed to perform fixed media electroacoustic music. And you can see those amazing red loudspeakers at the back, purpose-built. I mean, they're beautiful objects for playing specific frequencies. And this is what it looked like when the lights went off. This is in the huge concert hall for orchestral music, but they filled it with loudspeakers. Okay, so what I wanted to talk to you today about is what happens when you try and either study or teach this kind of music. And I'm dressing this up as the electroacoustic problem. And it is a bit of a problem in a way, because one of the things I've encountered throughout my life, throughout various different teachers, various different mentors, having done a PhD in electroacoustic music, and then having gone to Todd at various institutions, is that nobody's honest, really, about what they do in their practice, or they don't have the language to communicate what they do in their practice. And electroacoustic music, therefore, is a problem because if, I don't know, I go to an instrumental composer and ask them what they did and they don't want to tell me, I can still take their score and I can go and have a look at it. But the vast majority of this kind of music, there's no score. It's just made on a computer. It's a fixed medium. So there is no other document you can refer to. There's no script, there's no set of instructions, there's no identifying material which will tell you how they made that music. On top of that, there's no specific type of material. So I just played you three pieces. One is based on sounds of machines, one is based on sounds of a city, and the other is based on a choir with some completely fabricated drums. Electroacoustic music takes sound from anywhere, from all over the world around us. There's no hierarchical structure, which is to say that if you think about most forms of music throughout history, generally you'll be able to organize material either into this is the wind, this is percussion, this is strings, or alternatively, if you think of choral music even, you'll have tenor and soprano and bass. These are often hierarchical lines which organize material. There's no obvious approach to form, so we don't have the same idea that you can say, today I'm composing sonata form, and everybody knows what sonata form is, and then you begin organizing material relative to that formal idea. There's no such thing. And the other thing there isn't is any formalized system for analyzing this kind of music. There's a few people who have written some things on analyzing electroacoustic music, but there aren't really very many, and they're certainly not formalized. All of which means access to this music really is only through listening. And that creates something of a problem, because through listening you can't necessarily tell what anybody did. You have the end product, not the means of getting to that end product. Which brings me to this. So it's really helpful when composers are straightforward enough to tell you, this is what I did, which is what Daria just did, and that's brilliant, but it's very rare. So how do composers make their decisions? How do they take this material, work with it, and make decisions along the way about what is successful and what is not successful? Which leads to this third point. Well, we all fail in our practice all the time. Whatever practice you're doing, whether you're doing computer animation, web design, composition, we're all experts in failure. Yet I've never met a composer who will tell me, yeah, this piece I did is a bit rubbish. This one failed. You only get the things which didn't fail. The other thing is influences. I've very rarely heard a composer talk directly about what influenced them and who influenced them and which pieces to make a specific decision. Now, I've been moaning about these things for years. So which methods? I wrote a paper called the Methodology Mythology, where I'm arguing in the paper that the whole of my field, the methods that composers say they use are actually not true. Because they're all based on something which started in 1950s in Paris, when there was no scene of electronic music. There was no school of electronic music. There were no tools for making electronic music. There were no technologies. And so everything was experimental. But nowadays, things are far less experimental because we have predetermined tools. We have a canon of works. We have a history which has significant and less significant composers. You have communities of practice, competitions in electroacoustic music. And I don't believe that the same methods from the 1950s in Paris are the same today, even though everybody says that they are. Decision making, me and a colleague made a prototype piece of software which would hover in the background while composers worked, and it would track everything that they did. And the idea was that then you could recreate that piece at any point in time, at any step. So you could completely follow the process, and you could see what they used and what they didn't use. I did a talk in Sydney on failure, which was called Never Trust a Composer, which is my attempt to argue that composers never really tell you when they fail or not. my answer to this idea of influence is the piece I'm about to present to you, or I'll play you a little bit of it. The one that got the second prize in the competition today. It's called To US, or To US. So, a little bit about this piece. Well, for 10 years I worked here. This is the University of Sheffield, which is in the north of England. And this building housed the studios, which were called the University of Sheffield Sound Studios, which is the worst acronym ever, because if you put in Google USSS, you come up with the United States Secret Service, which doesn't help you very much. But anyway, so I worked there at USSS, and I was there for 10 years. And during that 10 years, I met with lots and lots of colleagues, lots and lots of composers. I had the great pleasure of having a wonderful community of people. And I left earlier this year in January, after working there 10 years. And I wanted to make them a leaving present. Say thank you very much and bye-bye. So I composed them this piece called To US, which is to the University of Sheffield Sound Studios. And I decided to base it on something I think is really important, which is this: communities. Communities develop ideas, share ideas, inspire people to do stuff. And I've been hugely inspired by my colleagues, by my friends, by my students over these years. So my program notes are this. I'll leave you to read them. And on. And finally, and this is the most important bit for me, this part. What I would like to see happen is that more and more people acknowledge the many influences that inspire and draw their work, and acknowledge that creative practice is like a spider web with connections to many, many different points. And for me, that came from a lot from my students. I'm inspired by them, and I hope that I inspire them in return. We create one of those webs. And for me, that's moved the whole practice on. It's moved it from something which was rooted in the early days in modernity, the 1950s Paris, the idea of there being a modernist approach to musical language and material, into something which I think has become nowadays a postmodern approach to music making. So that's that. The other thing is, I think communities of practice tend to develop certainly in music, I can't speak for other fields, but tend to develop their own sound. You have an ontology of the sound of an institute or an institution. And that's because of this idea of influence from one another. So I want to play you a few examples of some of the students that have inspired me. These are people that I've worked with over the past 10 years. I'm just going to play you some small examples, but the small examples are all things that then end up being in my piece in one way or another. Not because I took their material and used it, but because of being inspired by them, I worked with similar ideas with different material. So this is an example of a composer that this piece is based on his bike. He likes cycling, and he cycles around the hills outside of Sheffield. And all of the sound materials in this piece are based on the bike wheel running, so you get that of the spokes as the wheel goes around. But it's this huge wall of sound that interests me. If I could. huge amount of pitch in there and these sudden swells of energy coinciding with these small granular bicycle materials. Another example, Demetrius Sava, Cypriot composer who is at University of Sheffield for 5 years, I think. Very, very interesting composer. He has an idea of performative narrative in music, which is where he creates scripts for dancers and body performers to enact. He records them and he uses the recordings of these people making movements and sound within his compositions. So, little example. So for me, this idea of the physicality and the sense that you can hear human agency and presence generating those gestures and sound materials is very exciting. Vanessa Sorslovescu we're going to have to skip because I was going to play something of hers online, but I'm not connected to the internet, so never mind. Mario Caceres, Chilean composer who's still at University of Sheffield. Very different aesthetic. He's trying to do hybridization of musical styles. In particular, he's trying to look at ways in which you can create electroacoustic music using popular music forms and structures, all materials and electroacoustic forms, for want of a better description. So here's an example of his music.
Thank you, USSS. Thank you, USSS.
See what I'm trying to do here, which is build up a picture that this type of music is changing. And it's changing because of the input of, in this case, a younger composer, and in this case, an older one, but an equally young mind. Yes?
So, was the last piece you considered to be electroacoustic piece?
Well, that's a point of good debate, and I have this with him all the time, because he's writing a PhD thesis on the idea of hybridization. And the idea of hybridization is you take one thing and you take another thing and you put them together and you have something new in the middle. And to me, I would say to him, but hang on, that just sounds like, you know, some form of dance/pop music that you would hear on the radio on a slightly more experimental show. How is this hybridization? As the piece goes on, though, he starts to gradually disintegrate the materials and create alternative rhythmic ideas using the vocal sounds. So he sort of navigates his way from one approach to the other. But his argument, and I think he's right, his argument is that there's no such thing as a true hybrid. They don't exist. And the only thing that does exist is that you come with a cultural and social background to a piece of music. And from your social and cultural background, you'll recognize it as being this. So for somebody who's highly experienced in perhaps dance and electronica, then they will find the quirkier bits of this and the more experimental bits unusual. It's out of place. For me as an electroacoustic composer, it's very difficult for me to approach this as anything related to electroacoustic music. So his argument is, well, you make a balance somewhere. And so he's trying to explore that idea by taking one piece which is, say, rhythmic examples from pop music, another piece which is using granulation, a technique for chopping up sounds from electroacoustic music, another piece which is using form from pop music, so we all know the kind of 3-minute pop form, but instead use purely electroacoustic kind of sound world, so heavily developed or processed recorded material, etc., so that together he can kind of map out all the possibilities of what it might mean to make something hybrid. John Mercer, I kind of put this in because of you, Daria, because this piece was about Turing, the code breaking. But because of that, he has a lot of these kind of machine-like, Morse code-like material. One last example. Two last examples, sorry. From Julia Schaumann, a piece which is entirely based on recognizable instruments, in this case piano and saxophone, and really very limited development of those materials, except to extract pitch information to create ambience. There we go. Student example you're going to like. This is another person dealing with hybridization, but in this case he's dealing with hybridization of heavy metal and electroacoustic music. He's currently a student of mine at University of the Arts, but he was previously at Sheffield. Okay, I hope you get a sense of how eclectic these various inputs are in their manifestations and their different dealings with electroacoustic music. The very final example I want to play with is from my colleague of 10 years, professor now, Adrian Moore, who told me in all honesty when he showed me this picture, he said, look, it's me playing with my balls. This is a way that Adrian used to create material for his pieces. And this is a very actually famous piece of his called Counterattack, which he composed while I was working with him. And there's something about the opening of this piece which has always caught my attention. This event, followed by a repeat of the event, followed by some slight variation on it. And I'm playing it specifically because I copied it. So here we go. Finally, we get kind of to the point of my entire talk. So the piece, To US, I'll play you two little bits of it. Of course, you can listen to the whole thing on the Computer Space website, if you so choose. I'm just going to play a bit from the beginning, which is that pastiche of Adrian Moore's piece that you just heard. And I'll play you a bit at the end where I hope you get to kind of tie together a lot of those influences. This is a genuine and honest attempt to make homage to all these important people to me. So here we go. As I said, none of these materials are taken from those composers. It's just exploring similar ideas. that for a second because I can't skip in this. So you hear how it all comes together. So here we go. And that's it. Thank you very much. Yes.
What are some musicians from the UK, not necessarily electronic? What was the second part of the genre? Was acoustic, not electroacoustic musicians, but overall musicians that have inspired you?
Well, not necessarily electroacoustic ones.
Yes, just overall artists from the United Kingdom.
I think I'm predominantly listening to and predominantly being inspired by digital and electronic music. I mean, I do go to concerts of purely instrumental music, of course, and there are some things which I find inspiring, but they're not necessarily current, because I'm just not part of that scene. Most of what I hear which involves instruments is live electronics. But you know, I'm inspired by everything, really. I'm inspired by the sound in the street in Sophia today, walking here, as much as I'm inspired by things I listen to on the radio and think, what on earth is that? Versus experimental things, pop things. I mean, there isn't really a sort of category that I'm inspired by exclusively.
Okay, so I'm gonna ask a question related to one of my favorite artists.
Yep.
Have you been inspired by Aphex Twin?
Well, yes, absolutely. And in both senses of the Aphex Twin. The Aphex Twin, which is extremely active, percussive, glitchy, granular, that stuff, and also the long, sustained ambient Aphex Twin, yeah, absolutely. But the reason why I think Aphex Twin is particularly cool is kind of, I don't know, the Banksy of electronic music. Kind of invisible, kind of a bit naughty, bit playful, causing problems everywhere. So yes, absolutely.
And what about Birds of Canada, for example?
Who, sir?
Birds of Canada.
Oh, Birds of Canada. Less so for me. Although I did have some of their stuff some years ago on CD still. Yeah. Oof.
More light.
Any other thoughts, questions? Otherwise, we're done, I think. Good. Thank you for listening.